In some IT budgets, testing occupies a sizable portion, even as much as 40%. Now, why is that? In this TechKapihan episode, we invited our Center of Excellence Head for Testing, Attorney Kim Deloria, to shed some light on why you should do testing. Good morning, Kim.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm doing fine. It's a nice view here. I think I like it here.
So you're fine with the hot weather that we experience?
But it's not so hot inside the office.
Yeah, at least we have the air conditioning, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And how was the water? Was there a water shortage in your area?
No water shortage in my end. We're with the other service provider,
The
so we don't have we don't have water problems.
That's great to hear. So, Kim, today in this TechKapihan episode, we're going to discuss all about your expertise,
Okay.
which is testing.
Okay.
So, it might be good to start with what does testing do? What is it all about? Why is it important? And what happens when we don't adequately test software?
Okay. Maybe to answer your question, let me tell you a story.
Sure.
Okay. So this is a story. Have you ever seen the movie The Martian?
The Martian. Familiar.
It's Matt Damon. So the premise of the story was, obviously it's the Martian. They went on a mission to Mars. Unfortunately, because of an accident happened, the entire team flew away. But they thought that Matt Damon perished, but he actually survived. So he was forced to be resourceful and try to survive on Mars.
Sure.
So NASA learned about this problem later on, and they sent a rescue mission to they sent a rocket ship to try to rescue him in Mars. It was surprisingly accurate because in the movie it said that the process was going to take 9 months.
Alright.
The trip from Earth to Mars. Now, it was surprisingly accurate because a similar mission happened back in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
NASA sent a rocket ship to Mars with a payload of the Mars Climate Orbiter. Now, this was a satellite that was supposed to orbit around Mars.
Alright.
And its main purpose, obviously, since it's a climate orbiter, was to monitor the weather.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it would act as a future communications relay. So, if ever there would be astronauts in Mars and they want internet access, that would be their gateway.
Okay.
So it took 9 months to travel. Unfortunately, when the rocket ship was nearing Mars, the payload was released and the thrusters of the satellite went to Mars. It was a lot stronger than what it was intended. So as you can imagine, since the thrusters were stronger, it entered Mars at a steeper angle. And so what happened was $300 million worth of equipment became $300 million worth of fireworks in Mars. One of the most expensive fireworks in the history of mankind. And it happened in Mars. So nobody around was there to do it. Do you realize what the cause of that problem was? It was a software defect. It was a software defect.
Alright.
So now apparently, NASA commissioned Lockheed Martin. So Lockheed Martin, as you may well know, is an aviation corporation. Yes, and they specialize in military grade equipment.
Alright.
So they wrote the software for that climate orbiter, and the software was working correctly. NASA software was working correctly. However, they were not communicating correctly. Apparently, the software that Lockheed Martin was using was processing things in newtons, which is the measured force.
Alright.
NASA was sending information in pounds. So there was a difference in the two.
Units of measurement.
Yes, units of measurement. So apparently, this was expecting another particular unit of measure, and it was processing it differently because of the number difference. As you can imagine, that was why the thrusters were much stronger. Now, this is an example of what we call a defect, software defect caught in production, and it was worth $300 million. It's not that doesn't cover the cost of actually doing research. So it may and the cost of the launch. So it may very well be more than $300 million, probably about $500 million. So that's a very expensive software defect. So that was we typically call this caught in production. Now, can you imagine what would have been the cost if this was if the defect was caught during launch time?
During launch.
It would have cost maybe tens of millions of dollars, but definitely not 300 million.
Of course.
Okay, so again, so what if this was caught during the time that they were coding? Maybe it would be a few days delay, man hours, additional overtime. maybe in the hundreds of thousands of
Hundreds of
dollars,
thousands.
but not 300 million. But what if this was capturing documentation? So
During documentation.
yes. So maybe it would have been just a simple conversation. Yeah, we need to convert before we pass the parameters. So as you can imagine, this is why we test. So the earlier a defect is caught, the less expensive it becomes. That was a defect caught in production, worth $300 million. But if you're doing testing as often and as early as possible, you're actually reducing your time. Yeah, I mean the
cost.
The value. So this is where the value of testing comes in. It's actually it's ensuring quality and preventing defects. And the bottom line is, it saves you a lot of money by preventing all of those unwanted defects from getting caught
In production. Perfect. So you were mentioning several phases. What were those phases all about? Is it documentation, production? What are those phases?
Well, normally in software development, there are lots of software development methodologies. So there's Agile, there's Waterfall, but the underlying principle behind it is that in every phase of development, there's usually a conceptualization where requirements are gathered, and then they're refined, translated into requirements, developed, and then tested. So in each phase, you try to move testing as early as possible, depending on the software development methodology.
So testing doesn't need to happen only during the development phase.
Definitely, it doesn't need to happen in the development. Testing is a shared responsibility, not just by the testers, but by everyone. The stakeholders, the business analysts, the product owners, the developers, everyone.
Okay.
So it's a shared responsibility.
So with that, maybe we could go back a little bit to some definition of terms.
Sure.
So are there different kinds of testing?
Yes, definitely there are. And actually there's a whole gamut of terms out there. But they can be, perhaps you could, we could settle on this definition, like definition of continuous testing, for example. So continuous testing, it used to be the world was all waterfall, and then came Agile, which promised a faster development, and then Agile was I call this Agile is called DevOps. So what happens is that an initial release of the product is there in production, and then you try to release as often as possible. So these are micro releases, and DevOps is characterized by frequent deployments. But because of these frequent deployments, what's happening is that manual testing or doing testing fully on all manual cannot keep up. So you have to rely on a smart way of testing. You leverage test automation. So what happens is that you automate. You test early. You test as often as you can, so that when you release, it's as fully tested as it can be, with some manual validation at the end. So what happens is, since you automate, the moment that let's say a developer would check in his code, automated tests would run in the background to check if the build is okay, and then your functional test, automated functional test for the APIs, the things that you've set along your development pipeline, your DevOps pipeline. There's testing all throughout up until it reaches deployment, and there's additional testing at the end. So this process is called continuous testing. So there's I don't think I'm not sure if there's a settled definition for it. But that's the essence of it. Since in the DevOps world, there are frequent releases, and you need to do a lot of testing when that happens. So you automate those tests.
So you mentioned two types. There's continuous testing and test automation.
Yes.
Does one belong to another, or are they separate?
Well, they're not exactly mutually exclusive.
Okay.
In continuous testing, you're doing test automation. So when you talk about first, I have the distinction between automated testing and test automation.
All right.
In automated testing, you have manual tests, which are converted into automated test cases. When you run a regression test or a subset of the regression test, you're doing automated testing. So it's an automated script that's running that. Test automation, on the other hand, although they do sound the same, refers to the orchestration of these tests. So remember that DevOps pipeline was talking about where there are automated tests in that pipeline
along the way,
process.
yeah.
The process of monitoring and setting up those tests and the monitoring the results is called test automation. So in effect, your test automation takes a look at your automated testing along the way, whether it's in a DevOps pipeline or your typical test automation in a waterfall methodology in an agile context.
So you mentioned several types of development methodologies.
Mhm.
When do you settle, or when do you decide on what kind of testing you're going to perform? Is it going to be functional? Is it going to be manual testing? Is it going to go automated testing, or are you going to use test automation? Or are you going to go continuous testing?
It actually depends on what makes sense in a particular project. So if it's let's say if it's a waterfall project and it's usually just one big bang, at the onset it's going to be manual testing. But if you're going to keep on maintaining that system, doing those regression tests will take up a lot of time. So it makes sense to automate a certain subset of your manual or functional tests.
Okay.
So you save up on time. On an agile context, test automation is done in aid of development.
Alright.
So that's actually you're actually doing development testing. So you're leveraging automation to test APIs and APIs or
Use case.
web services.
Web services.
So you leverage test automation. At the same time, in an agile context where you have periodic sprints or periodic releases, your regression test will go over time. So initially, while you might start out doing functional testing, it makes sense to start automating these test cases, because when your regression test grows, ideally you should also develop your automated test cases so that you can keep up. So automation is essentially an accelerator, so it saves you time.
Okay, great. Those are a lot of information. That's very interesting. Can we go to? So we mentioned the manual testing. We mentioned test automation. Can we focus on test automation? Is that all right with you?
Sure.
So what are the benefits of test automation?
It can be summed up in this, and you can derive practically all benefits from this. It's the promise of test automation is that it will save you time, and when you save time, you save money. You have more. You have resources, have more free time to do the other things. Most ideally, they're supposed to. You can widen your test coverage, discover more details. Essentially, you're more efficient. So if you do test automation, you have more time, and then what you do with that time is essentially that promise.
Does test automation improve the accuracy of the tests that they?
Not necessarily. That's a very interesting question. A lot of people assume that if you do test automation, it's automatically a silver bullet which solves a lot of problem. That's not always the case.
Okay.
So, ever heard the term garbage in, garbage out? So
Yes,
your automated test cases are only as good as the developers that made it. So it doesn't make sense, for example, let's say that I've automated everything, but those tests are incorrect. So we have to ensure that, number one, that the manual tests that they are based in actually make sense. Number two, that the automated test correctly captures the essence of the manual test case, and that the validation is correct. Otherwise, you're just running something which doesn't really do anything. So a good part of the process involves ensuring that the automated tests that is testing exactly what it's supposed to test for.
Interesting. So is there a way to test automation?
Well, that's a $1 million question. Who guards the guardians?
Yes.
So essentially, because you're creating software to test another software, so who tests the software that you created?
Yes.
So now you don't have to go through the process of like automation inception where you do another automated test to test that. The first answer to that question is that first you have to ensure that you're doing the correct methodology. This is the part where you ensure that you have the correct automation framework.
Sure.
So there are existing frameworks out there which have already been have withstood the test of time.
Okay.
And then number one is having the correct methodology. Number two is having the right review process. So that's ensuring so it's not simply enough that you set something up and then run something. It needs to also be thoroughly evaluated. So
What do you review exactly?
the correctness or the accuracy of the automation script.
The automation
For me
script.
personally, because when you automate a manual test case, you obviously have to go through the process of executing it manually just to see if the steps make sense. And then the next step is you have your automation framework, and then you decide that based on this framework, how do I code these steps? So, where's my object repository? How do I validate? What's the validation? So, and then you piece all these together and
Sure.
ensure that the automated testing you did corresponds to the manual steps. And for you to validate that is simply take a look and see, okay, on this step, it was able to validate that this text is this, so this is correct.
So you're basically monitoring the steps that the test automation framework is going through.
Yes.
So you mentioned test automation framework. What are the more known test automation frameworks in the industry nowadays?
There are a lot actually, and they're just because variations of the same theme. So, but in essence, they typically would go on the keyword driven, meaning that so developers would create keywords, and then they would, and once they create the keywords, the the one who's in charge of writing the test would just put these keywords together to come to the test case. The other one is script modularity framework. Okay, so this is the part where you create blocks of code, and then these blocks of code correspond to a certain, let's say, a block of code is in charge of doing the manual steps. Then you have a certain blocks of code which are in charge of storing the page objects.
All right.
And then blocks of code which process the parameters.
Okay.
You put them together to create your test case. We call it the script modularity framework.
So there's a lot of
frameworks out there.
Frameworks. So we don't have I don't think we have enough time to go through all of them. But what about tools? What about test automation tools? What are the more widely known, or I've heard Gartner Quadrant. There are certain test automation tools out there.
Yes. I would like to classify these tools into two types: open source types, and then the paid types or the enterprise level automation types. And so here in Pointwest, we actually have the capabilities for both. And for the open source tools, we have I'm sure everybody has heard of Selenium, Selenium WebDriver, and so we do know that in using the varying automation frameworks for Selenium. And for the enterprise automation tools, we have expertise in Tricentis Tosca.
Tricentis Tosca.
And also Focus CFD. So these are functional automation tools, test automation tools, which are easy to use and already we have expertise in those.
All right. Thank you for those. And one of the last questions that I have is, what is the value proposition of your Center of Excellence, Testing Center of Excellence?
Okay. The obvious one is that doing test automation will obviously help you save time. And as I said earlier, once you save time, that translates into savings in money, wider test coverage, which would affect the quality of your software. So like the iron triangle, quality, speed, which is or time, and then the cost. So if you save up on the cost, eventually you will lead up to savings in time. And since you have time, you're able to widen your test coverage, do more exploratory tests, analyzing the behavior. So in effect, you are increasing the quality of your software. So that's the most obvious value proposition for test automation. And I would like to add is that we've been in the testing. Pointwest has been in the testing industry since 2003, ever since its existence. So we have expertise already. So it doesn't take a long time for us to learn tools, And we've had several projects where we open source and enterprise automation tools. We're able to leverage on our experience to exactly pinpoint on the specific test automation needs of the client.
Yeah. So that's more than around 16 years of experience in testing.
Roughly so.
And throughout those 16 years, in which industries is testing most often used?
Actually, it's used in a lot of industries.
It's cuts
Whatever,
across.
whatever their testing software, test automation can be leveraged.
Okay. All right. That's great to hear, Kim. And thank you for your time.
Sure.
Enjoy the
Yep.
rest of the day.
Yep.
It's a sunny day today.
I'm glad to be here.
All right.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you.